Thank you all for being here. We're super honored to be a part of the series. I've seen it a number of times with some of our great instructors and feel like I have a lot to live up to with Jeff here. Just very quickly wanted to tell you a little bit more about who I am. Jeff's going to tell you more about who he is. So I've been at the business school since around 2002. Before that, my undergraduate's in marketing. It is from Texas A&M down the road, so I usually apologize to people for that. I didn't know any better when I was young, although it was a great undergraduate experience. And then my MBA is from here at the University of Texas, so I found the way to the right path eventually. I said my undergraduate's in marketing. My MBA was focused on technology change management, so a bit of a shift there. More into technology, sort of internal management as well as product management for external customers. And technology became a thread throughout my career. And at some point along the way, so I've worked for companies like Walmart, at their home office as a buyer. I worked for American Airlines. I worked for Dell a few different times, actually. I worked for a .com as well as a medium web-based management firm, essentially. So a number of different kinds of firms, sizes of firms, different industries, and came back to my marketing roots before I started teaching here. And it was there in my sort of marketing role again, as well as starting to teach and do consulting here from the home base of UT, that I started to encounter this problem of innovation that organizations were having. And as I was trying to apply some of my past toolkits, which we'll talk about here in a little bit, I found sort of an impasse in terms of being able to really help drive more innovation for organizations. And that's where I found Jeff and design thinking overall as a new process for me, a new toolkit. And we coupled up and started teaching this topic and then full classes, and now do a lot of different things with companies as well as groups here at UT to educate them more about how design thinking can help drive innovation in their organizations. So Jeff?
Sure.
I didn't have that actually.
Hey everybody, I'm Jeff Mulhausen. I'm from a firm called Upstream. I've been in Austin about 20 years working in the field of design, and originally was working on a sort of traditional application of design in terms of designing and developing new product services and sort of getting them to market. And about 10, 11 years ago, my partners and I recognized sort of a need out there in the space of more and more companies were sort of trying to wrestle with this notion of innovation. How do we really think longer term, bigger picture, and where do we turn to sort of get that support? And so that was sort of the origins of Upstream, the firm that we create here and run out of Austin, where we help organizations sort of do that. Sort of we saw sort of that burgeoning need of people sort of needing that support, and then we also saw, which I'll talk about later, like a lot of the problems sort of moving beyond just your typical Fortune 500 application of design. So we really do three things at Upstream. We really help organizations figure out what is the innovation strategy that they're trying to pursue. The second, really still help develop some new offerings and experiences that they might want to bring to market. And the third is really help organizations with their internal organizational capacity for innovation. How do they learn to do it better themselves, which is why you're all probably here today. And so my perspective today will be from some of the things we've seen out there in the field in a number of different companies or organizations, for-profit and not-for-profit, and where we see some common patterns of the challenges that they're wrestling with. I can tell you all now, any concerns you have about your own process internally, you're not the only ones. So everyone we sort of meet with sort of feels like they're the only one struggling with parts of innovation, but the recognition is it's a widespread problem. It's a tough challenge. So we'll sort of reveal some of those patterns in the top 5 things that we'll present today with Stephen.
Yep. So we normally teach classes that can span a whole semester. We teach 8-hour kind of boot camp style things. We teach 4 hours. We have an hour together today. So we were working with Gail and team about what would be best, and we decided that what we wanted to do was give you some information and most importantly, a set of tools that you could hopefully actually start using as you leave today to start address innovation challenges at the individual level, at the team level, maybe in a group level. But we want to frame these tools within the broader issues that are creating barriers for innovation inside an entire organization, so that you understand where they fit in the broader challenges that organizations face. So depending on what level you are in the organization and what influence you have to drive innovation, then you've at least got tools as well as the context of where we see these barriers. So we thought it'd be helpful to start off with a table conversation. If you all could identify things that are standing in your way in your organizations, your teams, from being more innovative. Thought we'd give you a chance to talk about that. Then we'll reveal the challenges that we often see at organizations, and we see where we get a match here in just a moment. So if you all will talk for just a few minutes, if each person could share out challenges in your organization to innovation, to being more innovative. You can also think of this as being more creative, offering new ideas inside organizations, not just a sort of pure term of innovation. And then we'll get report outs quickly from tables. So about 3 to 5 minutes. Go now. All right. Gosh, I hate to do this because your conversation sounds so good,
Yeah.
but I'm going to bring us back together. We'll have some time at the end. You all are, be sure to exchange information. You all are having great
Seriously. We
conversations.
just do this for an hour.
The next session will just be, here's a topic you all discuss, and we'll see you in an hour. So I'd love to get some share outs to find out what you all were talking about. Can I start with this table right here? So you're saying the goal is to catch competitors, and that's disrupting the ability to actually be innovative, because we're really just trying to catch up to them.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you. And then also organizational history, almost a fear to try something new, try and be creative. We also talked about sort of blending with the existing culture, the logistics of trying something innovative.
Blending with the existing culture. Okay, so one was sort of a historical pattern. I'm repeating some of this, I think, for the effect of the video, by the way.
Please, yeah.
Since you're not mic'd and I am. So one was organizational history, is that right? Getting in the way is a barrier, it's not typically been innovative. And then connected to that is culture. The organization culture is afraid of innovation, doesn't like innovation, doesn't like change. Is that right? Okay.
Yeah, in part, my area of my company, we're new. The company's been around since like 1960, and our area just started up last year.
Okay.
So we have a lot of leeway to do what we want, but you can't just, barge in and just fit in with how the company has been presenting.
Were you all started as an innovation unit, or particular to be innovative, or was it just a new organization and because you're all new to it, you're hoping to be more innovative?
It is just a new organization.
Okay.
Most of us have been in the industry and have 10 years of experience or so, so
Yep.
we know the things that we experienced in other companies that we did or didn't like, and so we're trying to just keep the good and also grow
Yeah.
quickly because we are a global organization.
Okay. I was asking because we also see organizations that intentionally create a new group to be more innovative, and yet that new group still lives inside the history and the culture and all those things, right? And so they also still struggle. Thank you all very much. Let me know if you want to go. Otherwise, I'm just going to call on a couple other tables. Let me go back there to get a different row.
One of the barriers that we talked about was having a really good mix of staff. Some people who've been there a really long time
Okay, a mix of staff.
want to keep doing the same things that we've been doing, and then people who want to try new things.
Okay. Do you all find this to be age-related, or just time and company-related, or time and industry-related? Yeah. Okay. Very good. Did y'all have something else? Okay.
So I work in the financial services industry, so it's a highly regulated one as well. So you don't want your banks to be extremely adventurous with your money.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, we've talked about before a time and a place for creativity, and accounting
Right.
and financial management is
Right.
oftentimes not where you want wild abandonment with
departments.
creativity.
And we're actually a group of CPAs.
Okay.
And what we looked at is.
An alum.
I'm an alum as well, but what we were really looking at is our interaction with customers and data is the places where we can be innovative.
Right.
But not in
Okay.
what we actually produce.
That's great.
Okay. Okay. And how you understand the data and how you understand customers in terms of what their issues are?
How we
Interact with them?
interact with them in
Okay.
different ways.
Okay. Oh, that's good. That's really helpful to see the distinction between where you think there's opportunities for innovation,
And where we're actually kind of close.
where you got to stay contained. Yeah. One more table. How about this one?
I think something that resonated with everybody at the table was competing agendas.
Okay.
So the silos that we talked about.
Yeah.
University, folks from Chamber of Commerce, and so each of these different groups, right, has a different agenda, and maybe has a different vision of where they want to go.
Yeah.
So this would be, and then instability in those positions. So instability in leadership, instability in the organization itself.
Okay. So again, competition among siloed parts of the organization, competing agendas, sometimes competing vision. And the second one was what again?
Instability.
Instability.
So in whether it's
Turnover.
organization,
Yeah.
turnover, right, in the
Yeah.
leadership, and each time they have a new vision, so there's not an opportunity, right, to get the traction and keep going.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, it sounds like there's no shortage of barriers to innovation inside organizations. We're going to hit on a few of these, not all of these though, so this is helpful to hear what else is affecting you in organizations. Again, what we tried to do is find tools that were useful today, but also would address kind of the larger issues inside organizations that we most frequently see as barriers to innovation. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jeff to give you a bit of a framework of design thinking. How many of you actually have had some experience with design thinking, directly using design thinking processes and tools?
Awesome.
Even if you're not sure, maybe, okay? How many of you know of design thinking but had never really had the opportunity to use it as a toolkit, as a process? Is there anyone for whom design thinking is a new term today, which is also fine? Okay, awesome. Okay, good. So we want to give a bit of a framework of design and design thinking, demystified a bit. It's taken on somewhat of mystique over the past few years. So you understand how we think about it, how we think a lot of designers think about it. And then we'll dive into the 5 stalling factors. One of the reasons we titled or I guess the reason we titled the presentation the way that we did was we see organizations now effectively adopting design and design thinking as a way to more reliably drive innovation in the organization, as opposed to just hoping that innovation happens. So that's where we got the idea of driving an innovation, an engine of innovation, and yet even companies that are more intentional about it still have factors that impede innovation, disrupt this process, that we called stalling factors, things that stall out the engine of innovation. So that's what we framed it. We wanted to give you an overview of how we think about design thinking first.
Great, thanks, Stephen. So, good to see a lot of you have heard about design thinking. Steve and I like to joke we were teaching this back at UT back when nobody cared about it 10, 15 years ago. And now it's sort of a big popular term, which in and of itself is exciting, but also sort of adds some confusion, I think, to the market space, because everybody wants to start speaking of it. So I'll give you a few slides and just some ways that hopefully make this seem a little bit simpler, because it's one of the lenses we're approaching as we think about innovation here. There's lots of ways we could go into it. This is sort of the way today for our limited time together. So you'll often see sort of this sort of representation of sort of innovation or design thinking being the intersection of people, business, and technology. The notions of viability, feasibility, and desirability is sort of that intersection that sort of creates something new. You certainly could do things in any one of the circles, but sort of the mission here is sort of where do they unify really? And design thinking for the purposes of today and sort of the term human-centered that you often hear accompanying that is really that we're going in through that people-centered lens, really. So, and that's sort of what's often missing in organizations. And so it's representing all of them, but sort of our approach is really going to be anchored in sort of the people with an understanding of the others. These words mess people up too, because we hear the word, design and design everything, and I want to sort of caution that sometimes these terms and even an organization can get thrown around like a magical thing, and we just need design and everything else will figure itself out. And so we simply just try to go back to sort of design being some agent of change, either an individual or some activity. That's all that sort of originated from. And then design thinking is really just the notion of applying that kind of a process to other kinds of challenges. And in this case, we're trying to find more opportunity for innovation. One way that may be helpful for you to think about design thinking is simply really 2 things. There's sort of a method of sort of a rigorous process that you'll go through, and then there's sort of a mindset, which is sort of how do we even think about this, right? Which is some of like how do we understand the people we're trying to serve more, and how do we embrace some of these principles that sort of respond against these cultures of fear or other things that you'll see inside of an organization. So what we've seen as well in the market, and I referenced a bit earlier, is we're seeing design thinking now getting a lot of attention because it's being applied to broader problem sets, right? So this used to be the domain of like the Fortune 500s, the Procter & Gamble's, the Nikes. Everybody would design a new widget and we could apply this. And what we've seen over the last decade at least is now we see this appearing and people recognizing this can work in a not-for-profit sector as well as for-profit. This can work in a healthcare experience as well as it can in the design of a new physical object. And that wasn't the way the world was sort of thinking a decade ago. So we've seen a lot of attention there and a lot of people interested in how could I solve these problems in different ways to get a bigger impact. And so that's sort of like at the root of, I think, what we're seeing design thinking being applied to. It doesn't mean it couldn't be applied to small things, but we're seeing it get applied to sort of broad problem sets out there that weren't the case a while ago. Another simplifying way to consider design as an approach is really just sort of these highest level things here, there's really an emphasis on problem seeking, and we'll talk a lot more about this. So where is the space we sure to find that opportunity? And then some new methods for problem solving, how we achieve that, all in sort of in service of implementing an eventual solution. For the purpose of innovation today and sort of how we're trying to talk about it for this conversation, the notion of increasing the number of opportunities we have in solution and ideas and the range, and sort of really trying to match those with what we think is appropriate for our organization to meet the needs of sort of the customers and even beyond that, just the stakeholders involved in our organization. This approach is sort of well built to sort of fuel that part of your innovation engine. Now that's a high level one. Now you'll see often that applied to sort of a more detailed sort of process. This is one, there's several out there, but they're all very similar in the sense that there's a sequence of sort of steps that sort of are iterative in nature, but we're going through sort of an understanding and a definition of the problem in the problem seeking area, and then sort of the solving areas where we're ideating, prototyping, testing, that notion that you'll hear about rapid prototyping, iteration, not being afraid to fail, we're going to try things and learn from it. That's where we really see sort of that aspect happening. I will say two things on this front is really the notion that design thinking is not a reckless process. It is rigorous. Some people will misunderstand it as like, oh, that's just the Post-it note thing, and that's not really valid.
The giggles mean that a lot of people think that. But
it happens. And then I'll say the other is like this is a structure you'll often see in sort of some of the steps, but how you articulate it in your organization is something you shouldn't overlook. We don't advocate like a one-size-fits-all approach to this stuff. We think it's really sort of cultural inside an organization, and how you decide to sort of deploy this process and describe it and train people on it should be sort of unique to sort of the culture of your organization. But fundamentally, we're going through all these sorts of steps that we'll reference a little bit more later in the presentation. As I mentioned, sort of some of the outcomes are getting bigger out there. Certainly, sort of we're applying this and seeing sort of new products and services, but as someone referenced earlier, so this notion of customer experience really becomes unlocked when you start to think this way. That could be sort of where the biggest innovation is how are we interacting with our CPA clientele, for example. That could be vastly innovative without changing sort of the core of what we do. Strategy and culture, but we also see sort of this policy, social good thing. Essentially bigger problem sets, sort of we're asking design thinking to sort of contribute to those solutions. So that was a bit of a sort of a primer just to kind of give you some of the language and thinking of sort of where we're coming from as we talk today more about design thinking. We wanted to sort of introduce 5 of the factors that we're seeing out there, and these are sort of cross-organization. I think we've tried to choose the top 5 that really aren't, is this a for-profit, is this a non-profit, is this a big or small? They're pretty common across everything that we've seen. And as Stephen mentioned, you know, we have a limited time today, so what we've tried to do is pick something that you might take away as an actionable thing to think about or look up later when you get back, and sort of put this in a broader context of the challenge you may be facing as one of the leaders for innovation in your organization. Anything else on the setup of this? So let me go into the first. We're sort of going to give you sort of what we see as the biggest sort of stalls and sort of where it's coming from and sort of what we might be able to do to approach it or things that might be helpful. And then at the end, I think we've reserved some time for some Q&A because, as we mentioned, these issues appear uniquely inside organizations, but they all do sort of ladder up to sort of the same themes. So this is the first one, and I think we've heard some reference to it already. Really, the first stall here that holds people back is really seeking innovation only at the product service level. And so what do we mean there is it's really sort of narrow and focused and iterative. And it's sort of the classic way that we think about how do we do something different than we did last year. You know, we change the color of it, or we add a little feature to it, or we do something, make it incrementally better. And what we see is sort of organizations being sort of stuck at that level, and all the energy is being put in there. We're never able to sort of make these bigger leaps. And the cause of that we've seen, and someone referenced it earlier, is really this silo thing, right? And so the nature of how we've organized ourselves is to put ourselves in these little groups, usually functionally part of the business, and sort of we try to investigate sort of new things we can do. But we're missing opportunity as these silos or these departments work together, because we have to remember the people we're serving out there, our customers, they don't live in that world. They don't really care what department we're in. They're trying to experience something holistically from our brand or our organization. And sort of this approach sort of limits things. And so we find all the energies being focused at a very incremental level. and not responding to the bigger calls for innovation. So I won't ask anybody if they've heard this, but you've probably seen this dimension out there. You know, a lot of the press now is CEO of blank or leader of blank has a press release that says we're going to disrupt our industry, we're going to transform whatever industry it is. And then you get back inside and talk to people working, and you're like, what are you working on? Well, I just got to get something done by Friday, and I got to get this thing. Sweet. And you see this disconnect, right? This call for innovation wants to be huge, and then we find ourselves sort of buried down at the sort of in the weeds. And that happens for a lot of reasons, but we see typically from this legacy of sort of the way we're organized. It doesn't mean we have to fully reorganize, but just a recognition of sort of where that's stemming from. One of the ways to start to think about that differently is really these sort of levels of innovation. There's some classic ones we'll talk about, but really what we're showing here is at the bottom there, like this extending of sort of what we did sort of last year, or how we tweak a feature, is sort of that lowest level. One way that we find helpful in organizations is think this idea of bigger picture. If we zoomed up and thought bigger, we get to sort of a bigger appreciation for what's going out in the market that we're trying to serve. And that starts to sort of include, oh, I need to include this group or that department or these other people to start thinking that way. Before we even get to that point of getting people working together, we often see like this construct simply sort of missing inside of an organization, right? And so you can define sort of like the classic, or sort of, you'll hear them called horizons or sort of the tiers of innovation, being sort of incremental, what we've all sort of talked about, to sort of adjacent, really doing what we do, but sort of bringing it to a new market, and then transformational, like really sort of radically new, sort of new products, new markets, new customers we're serving. Often the PR buzz is on that top level, right? And then the internal work is on that bottom level. Sometimes we see it simply because nobody's really even thought this way, right? And so one of the learnings that you may be able to take back to your organization if you're not is to say sort of what's our portfolio of innovation, right? You think of it that way, you're not putting all your eggs in one basket, right? It's like a financial portfolio. We don't invest in like one security, right? We distribute around. This is sort of a healthy way to think about putting energies in different areas and sort of relieve some of that tension where somebody might be working on the bottom, somebody might be on the top, they're crashing into each other. Nobody's really said this is sort of the portfolio that we're embarking on for the purposes of innovation. The other thing you'll see that happens on the transformational is like, you know, the swing for the fence, we're going to do one thing and hope to hit a home run and we're going to make $1 billion. And there's really not an appreciation that we're trying multiple things. In some of the literature, we see this sort of ratio out there. There used to be a conventional wisdom around the sort of distribution of this being sort of 70% on the incremental line, maybe 10, 15 years ago. And now the recent guidance sort of shifting. So what we're seeing in the market now in some of the latest data is organizations are now trying to shift that proportion to be heavier weighted on the higher order transformational innovation initiatives. And even sort of leading companies sort of shifting that to be a much bigger proportion of it. There isn't one right answer for everybody, but again, just the notion of having this conversation inside your organization might be helpful as you think about where you're applying resources. One other rationale of sort of where this originated in is it used to be a lot harder to do transformational information or transformational innovation. It took a lot more resources. It was a lot slower just to do things in the market. And now we're seeing that not as much being the case. You see how quickly sort of disruptive ideas can sort of be developed and formed and get to market. And so that's giving organizations more confidence to sort of put investments in the higher order. One way we wanted to sort of provide beyond that sort of tip of sort of having that discussion in the organization is a tool that some of you may have seen, but we see it particularly useful in this challenge of the business model canvas. And this is a tool used to help conceptualize, have a conversation, explore what new opportunities would be on a higher order sort of innovation. And even if it's on an incremental approach, what it does is it forces your team to sort of answer sort of questions or consider different aspects of the business, which invites other departments or other personnel into the conversation. Too often we see innovation being a domain of, you know, it's just the engineering team or it's just the marketing team, and you have these like turf wars that arise. So we've seen this be a useful tool and something maybe simple that you could go back and say, what if we did a session sort of leveraging this? How would we formulate a concept based on the business model canvas? These are sort of, if you haven't seen it, we'll send some material around after the session that would give you some reference to things like this. But this is a particularly good tool for bringing different kind of parts of the business together. And what you find is it typically unlocks new thinking at a business model level, right? And nothing in here is really encouraging you to say, like, what color should you change your product to next quarter? It's making you think about sort of the bigger picture. Who are we serving? What are the value propositions? So that's stall one. An example of it in the space of somebody that we think is sort of good at this is Netflix. Those of us, I guess we're all old enough to remember the actual DVDs in the mail.
And Blockbuster before.
And Blockbuster before, which we use that less often now because most of the people are like, what's Blockbuster? Yeah.
Sad but true. Sad but true.
Yeah, it's crazy. So the Netflix sort of origin certainly was a disruptive model in and of itself, but you see sort of their evolution sort of not being incremental in nature, right? As they sort of disrupted initially with the idea and then sort of expanded to sort of the streaming and sort of holistic experience of recommending and content management, and then ultimately sort of content development. They got into a business that really no one expected they would enter. They're sort of thinking of their business at a very high level and sort of transforming it in those iterations in a relatively short amount of time. So we think that's a good example out there. Not everything in this sort of stall needs to be resolved by like some big, humongous new concept, but just the notion of thinking about the levels of innovation is often helpful inside the organization, at least to separate activities or to have the conversation of maybe we should be putting more initiatives in one area or the other. Stall number two.
Yeah, I actually asked Jeff if I could have this one because it's near and dear to my heart. It was part of the personal experience I was describing earlier. As a marketer, probably 15 years ago, after the dot-com craze and after the dot-com bust, as organizations got more serious, more concerned about being disrupted, not by the competitor set that they knew of today, but by the competitors they had no idea existed in their own garages. And they wanted to get more intentional about driving innovation in their organization. And that's where I was trying to come in to be helpful. But I really had a skill set that was based off of my experience, my education, which was in marketing. This is a classic marketing framework that we teach now still today in our marketing principles class here at UT, which is still super helpful and super valuable for driving day-to-day and even a bit longer range marketing activities and strategy. Does this look familiar to anyone? If you remember your marketing education from business school, if you had it, 5 C's, STP, and 4 Ps. That's the connection, yeah. That's what this is. It's written a little fancier because it came out of a Harvard document, I will admit. But it's essentially 5 C's, STP, and 4 Ps. And I was still trying to apply this to the challenge of innovation and running into a lot of barriers because this is a model that's really built to understand our customers day to day to day to day to day, and really, when it comes down to it, incrementally improve our ability to serve them every single day. So again, it's super helpful and a great tool for that challenge, not for the challenge of innovation. And so what we need is, because that tool often, that marketing toolkit of 5 C's, STPs, and 4 Ps, keeps us at a higher level of understanding our customer base and the marketplace overall. When we think about the activities around segmentation, targeting, and positioning, we're usually looking at quantitative data sets that give us an aggregate look at the marketplace so that we can make better choices about marketing execution. And what we need to drive innovation is a much deeper understanding of what's happening in people's lives, individuals' lives today, the experiences they have, what they're trying to achieve through those experiences, and the challenges they face in those experiences. And so we need a different toolkit that's at a more human level, a more individual scale. This is an example of one of the tools that we use, which is called an empathy map, to build greater empathy for the individuals that we're trying to serve. So rather than having a marketplace look and view, which is helpful for some challenges, this is really getting into a deep dive. We often talk about driving the thick data as opposed to the big data. The thick data being people's rich stories about their experiences in their daily lives. The important thing about this is we can say that out loud, that we want to understand people more deeply. We want to understand their stories. But without a tool to do that, without a toolkit to do it, it just doesn't happen. And so this empathy map is a really great tool to use in a number of different ways. So I use this with teams when we're just trying to start off the innovation process and we say that we need to build empathy as a part of this process. But how do we do that? Well, let's first surface what we think we understand, what we think we know about the individuals that we're trying to serve. And we collect all of those assumptions, oftentimes all of those biases and thoughts, and curiosities and questions that we've got and that collectively the team has onto a framework like this so we can talk about them more explicitly. And what that's ultimately going to drive is where we don't know what we understand and what we don't understand, where we as a team disagree about what we think is happening in people's lives, where we want to test our assumptions and our biases to see if we're actually correct and try to disprove them as much as we prove them. Where as a team we want to spend our time, our resources in terms of researching and understanding people at a more human level, a more individual level. So we can project all of those things on here to have those discussions, and then, knowing that they are our assumptions, questions, turn those into research activities. We'll talk about that in just a little bit as another tool related to a stall factor. But turn those into a research activity where we can really dive deeper into people's experiences and their stories. So that's one way to use it. The other way is once we've done our research, once we've gone out and done, which we're not going to go in depth about how to do really great qualitative research in this area. You need to come back for another class for that. But once we've done our good research with individuals at that human story level, we can take that data and lay it into a framework to understand it better as a team. And this is one of the tools that we can use to do that. There are a number of tools out there that will help us take the qualitative, really qualitative data we've got and into a tool to help us analyze it better. We often think one of the myths about qualitative data research or qualitative research methods is that they're unstructured, that you can't really analyze the data like you can quantitative data. But you can do really rich, robust analysis as long as you have the right tools to drive that analysis and the frameworks to go with it. I want to show you an outcome of this empathy building activity, which is persona building. So we often make the connection that we work on segments and segmentation when we're coming at it from a marketing discipline. We work at the persona level when we come at it from a design discipline. Marketing, though, has found this persona building activity so helpful that we've actually started to incorporate it into our marketing activity so that we can understand people at a more individual level as opposed to just the higher level segmentation data that we typically think about, the demographic data, for example. And we build personas to understand people better. Again, the richness of their stories, the richness of their lives. This actually comes, I want to give you the quick background. This comes from a student who was in a design class with me. And really, even by the end of the class, her one hang-up was personas. She felt like they were too specific, that if you designed for them, you would design something so narrow that the marketplace would never accept it, and she just didn't see how it could provide value in a lot of different industries. She went to go work for a telecommunications services firm, and on her very first day on the job, her manager gave her a book and said, these are the 6 personas that we design and manage around all of our activities, so your first activity is to go home and start learning these 6 personas inside and out. So she wrote me that night, that email, and so I begged her to send me the book, which she did. I did redact out the company name at her request, but I was allowed to say it's telecommunication services. But this is a really great example of what persona building looks like, where you have photos of real people who represent the persona so you get an understanding of who they are. You can see their faces. What you can see here really quickly from these first 2 pages is that this is not typical demographic segmentation. These people come from all different kinds of backgrounds, but they share a way of life, especially around the context of telecommunications, that is important to this company to understand their customer base, again, better at a more human individual level. So you see photographs oftentimes, you hear stories and see quotes as a part of persona building so you can understand their stories more clearly. It's all more tangible to us as researchers. You see a few of those things here. One more here. This is a guy who owns his own, I think it's a pool company or construction company, it says in there, but also does a lot of activities with his family and has to balance these competing priorities. So we find these persona building really helpful in terms of driving design activities, but also I have to say they also serve as a really big point of inspiration for us. We think of design as being a very generous type of work where we're trying to truly add value to people's lives. And the more that you feel connected to those people you're designing for, the more inspired you are to do good work for them. And we see that to be true over and over. I want to give you an example that's also close to home. It's a pill organizer. My mother is at an age and a lifestyle set of choices, honestly, where she takes a lot of pills. My mother has not met a supplement that she doesn't like. And she's also of the mindset that if some is good, then more is even better. So She started off with a system for organizing her pills. I have to tell you, it's pretty agonizing to watch, especially as she gets older. Starts to have dexterity issues as well as memory issues now. And we could try to improve on this idea of the pill sorter by adding, for someone like my mother, another row. Helps you get a little bit better in terms of you've got your AM pills and your PM pills. You can even go further. I traveled with an older couple that had this. First time I'd seen 4 rows. There's a lot of pills, a lot of sorting going on here. You can even put what people stereotypically think of designers touch on this by doing something aesthetically interesting to it, by making it 3-dimensional and making it look like the crystals out of Superman's lair. But it doesn't actually address the underlying human problem here, which is someone who has to go through and sort their pills every single time they end the regimen that's here, right? And so a company that took a completely different approach to this is called PillPack. You give this company your prescriptions. You tell them what vitamins and supplements you take and on what sort of regularity. And they put each one of those into a pack, and each pack represents a dose, essentially. These are the pills you take. They are date stamped and they're time stamped. So if you have memory issues, you know as you look at the pack, have you taken this one? Is it time to take it? And also addresses all the dexterity issues of having someone to spend time and fumble through sorting their pills. So this was, it may not seem like a huge revelation, but it's a huge change in that marketplace, and especially for the people who have to deal with this challenge. Has anyone ever heard of this company? Mm-hmm. Do you know who bought this company? No, I don't think so. Amazon. Someone saying Amazon? Amazon bought it. Amazon made an announcement they were interested in getting into the healthcare space, and this was one of their first purchases, which tells you how they're thinking about it and the value they can provide to it. Okay, so the next one is, speaking of, well, if we're going to understand people at a more human level, if we're going to try to do more empathy building and create personas, we need a different toolkit of research methodologies to be able to do it. A lot of people want to rely back on our traditional methods that give us a lot of quantitative data. We especially have a preference in a lot of our organizations for quantitative data, and we feel like the bigger the data set, the better the data is. What's important is, while these big data sets serve really important purposes, so I don't ever want to discount the importance that big data drives for a lot of organizations in terms of improving their operations and in some cases improving the customer experience in certain ways. What it lacks is the forward-looking insight that we need as opposed to the backward rear-view look that quantitative data sets give us. So what we see is organizations that have very large quantitative data sets still frustrated by the lack of innovation in spite of all this data. And it's really that the insight that drives innovation just can't live inside historical data sets that capture what people are doing today. The example I often give is if you think about an Uber and what that company did in terms of changing transportation inside an urban area, the data that they needed wasn't housed inside taxi data. It didn't exist there. People using taxis to get around. The insight about an Uber platform, an Uber business model, didn't exist in that data set. It didn't matter how big that data set was, it just couldn't exist there. But if we really explore on that human level again what people are experiencing in terms of transportation across an urban area, we can see where a lot of the flaws and challenges are. So a lot of companies, rightfully so, are driving these dashboard looks at the quantitative data sets. And we can essentially become kind of in that trance of looking at our quantitative data and watching the up and down ticks of it. And what that does is often disassociate us from the human interaction, the human level of understanding that we need. And so we need different kinds of qualitative data research methods to actually get to these insights that help us drive innovation. This requires us, number one, to get out into the field next to people, next to the people that we're designing for, rather than in our offices behind our dashboards. So we have to be in the field, in the context, in situation to be able to do it. And the particular toolkit we wanted to show you all today was what we often call generative research tools. And they're generative because they generate a document, something that is sort of archival in the sense of it's a piece of living sort of work that happens in between the researcher and the participant. And a very common one in particular of generative research methods is what we call day in the life. This is one tool we used for a project we were on for a local news media company. They were interested in understanding how people Well, we on their behalf, honestly, were interested in understanding how people come across news and information, how they react to it, now in our sharing culture, what they do in terms of sharing it, amplifying it, sending it to others, and what that whole process looked like. So we wanted to understand what a day in the life looked like for people in terms of how they encountered information and data and what happened throughout the day with that. So that bottom line there represents when you get up and when you go to bed, and the boxes at the top were to understand the kinds of news and information that they come across throughout the day that was important to them, where in the day it happened, so we had them draw lines from one box to the day part that was data and information that they either came across or went and sought. And we also layered into this the kinds of technology they used to actually access or get that data, and then what they did with it after that. That was a long conversation. We had the participant take a marker. We turned this paper around for them to fill out as we gave them this series of prompts. Number one, dividing up your day into day parts so we can see how you live your day. And then two, drawing these lines. I'm so sorry, I meant to take a picture of what an actual one of these documents look like so you can see the messiness of it. Because what we don't do is take that piece of paper and close our ears while someone fills it out and then go look at it later on. It's really a document to engage a research participant and drive that important conversation through a series of prompts and understand their lives, their stories better. This is another one that we use very commonly that's essentially a riff on the day in the life, which is a journey map. How many of you have heard of journey maps? Good. We often use these also as a research tool. This is one we used to understand travel experiences. Travel experiences. And again, we, through a series of prompts, ask our research participants to complete this journey of group travel, in this case, group or family travel. And importantly, journey maps don't just show us the sequence of events, the activities, and the order in which they happen, but we talk about the layers of a journey map that we build. So who else is involved? How are they influencing this journey? What information sources do they access across the journey? That's always helpful. And really helpful is what's the emotional experience at each stage of this journey. And again, it's not just the document that's produced, it's the conversation that's driven through these types of engagement tools that we use with research participants. Here's one that looks really pretty, by the way. It's an outcome of that one.
One of the other things to think about for that. Okay, sorry.
No, you go ahead.
No, I was going to say, well, if you go back a step to the journey, a consideration is you sort of bring back to the organization. We often see the issue that organizations have like half the story, right? And the half you always have is the sales funnel story, right? We can talk about it. We have awareness and consideration. And the reality is, like, none of us woke up today and say, I'm going to convert myself into buying that thing. Like, we don't live that way, right? So you have that half story we need to know from the internal of our organization, but we often too much apply that out into the world of like how people really live. And so what we say is these kinds of artifacts then bring the other half of the story, right? Our business sort of needs to mesh with the life that they live, and how do they define the parts of their day or the choices that they make, and how do they make those decisions? And then sort of together you can have a bigger picture to sort of drive the innovation. Nothing we're saying today is really advocating anything that we have on the data side is wrong and you need to get rid of it. It's often sort of an augmentation that you're missing that sort of holds you back from having the big picture to drive sort of the bigger innovation initiatives.
The example I want to give you of this one is, it's a bit famous now. This is an MRI machine. Out of curiosity, how many of you all have had an MRI before? I'm always shocked by most of the audience that we're all having MRIs. It floors me. It floors me, I know. You got to pay for the machines, that's right. There's a guy named Doug Dietz. He's an industrial designer for GE. A few years back, he designed top-of-the-line, latest technology, award-winning, literally an industrial design award-winning MRI machine. His focus as an industrial designer was to design the very best MRI machine, which meant it produced the very best images for those who were actually reading the images and trying to diagnose. So he was invited to a hospital to come see his work put into place, this new machine. He was so excited. They were bringing the patient down. The patient happened to be a young girl who was coming for an MRI. I forget what the concern was. And he got to see her coming down the hallway, crying, holding on to Mom's hand with this really firm grip. Mom was essentially almost having to drag the child down, telling her that we've talked about this already, you got to be brave, it won't last very long. They could see that this was not going to happen, so the MRI technician had to call for the anesthesiologist to come down to sedate the child in order to get her in the machine. It always sends chills down my spine because I've been in this situation before. And he realized that in spite of this design award, the design was ultimately a failure, because if people are too afraid to get in the machine, if it's that fearful, fear-inducing kind of experience, then it's a failure of a design. So he took an empathetic design course, actually, and started to use methodologies like we've talked about to understand that human-level experience a bit better, and realized that for kids especially, what they needed was an adventure. They respond to stories, as we all do, but especially kids respond to stories. And so what they designed was not just the MRI machine, but the entire experience from the moment the child shows up at the hospital, which is you're going on an adventure. In this case, it's a pirate adventure. You're going to go look for treasure. Part of that journey is going to include a ride on a ship. By the way, while you're on the ship, you're going to have to stay really still, because you're going to be inside a closed cabin, so no one knows that you're traveling in the ship. But on the other side, you'll get to find the treasure, and of course, there's a treasure chest afterwards that they go and get. There's a space one where they get into sort of an astronaut-looking thing. They're going to go on a space mission. While they're in the spaceship, it's really tight. They need to stay really still. It's important to keep the spaceship stable. And these kind of cues make kids actually excited about the MRI experience, and they minimize the things that are really important in terms of producing a strong image. So this is now, I think most children's hospitals have this kind of MRI experience for their kids. So I love that example.
We particularly see that stall being an opportunity in the healthcare space, just as we used that reference, and other businesses that are inherently like service businesses, right? I said at the beginning, often you heard design in the older days of it had to be a thing, right, a tangible thing, and now we hear so much about service design being sort of a new domain of people applying this to that sort of thinking. We see it a lot as sort of certainly healthcare needs to start to behave a bit more like a consumer brand does, and we still see a lot of that sector defining that patient experience, that customer journey as like, well, they walk through the clinic door here, then they do some stuff, and then they exit the clinic door. And we're like, that's really not like the experience that they have as a person with healthcare, but that's sort of how we've sort of built these businesses. So that's a particularly good area to sort of apply if you're in a service-related business to sort of find where the opportunities are for the future. Stall 4, I would say this is probably the most common one that we see across any kind of organization type. Developing solutions without understanding the challenge to be solved. We've tried to upload all these, we'll talk a little bit more at the end, to sort of the bigger picture, right? So we don't get buried in these tactics and all the, the post-it note thing again. Really, this is a resource allocation issue for those of you in sort of the leadership role. Because what's happening here is we're sort of sending resources and teams off on different sort of pathways to do different things, and we've really skipped that step of a rigorous sort of exploration of what should we really be solving here for the purposes of innovation. A lot of that happens, we've seen, because there's some arbitrary process in your organization that looks like this on how we make new things, and it always sort of just starts with like a requirements document, and it doesn't really adopt for a step before that, right? And so we'll often say, well, where did the idea come from, or what do we, well, Joe down in marketing is real smart and creative. He always comes up with cool stuff. And you're like, well, that can't be like the process, right? But it too often like is, right? And so we say it's a resource allocation issue because now you've sort of just taken that to be the case, and now we've launched this process against it, and we've sort of deployed the resources, which are often still scarce in the realm of innovation, because we never really went through sort of a rigorous step of how do we define the challenge. So we see this sort of everywhere we've sort of worked, being sort of a missing step. And there's a sort of simple way you can start thinking about it. Those of you who have been in a design thinking course before will be familiar with sort of the how might we statement, which is a really good way to sort of at least begin the conversation of defining opportunities for what we might solve. There's some important language in there, sort of simply the word using might sort of diffuses a lot of these conversations of saying, how can we do this? It already gets everybody, well, we didn't say we're going to do that. How do we know? So even just sort of the how might we've seen has a lot of importance. But effectively, you're sort of formulating a statement of a challenge that you may try to tackle. And it has sort of three components in it, typically an audience outcome and impact, when they're sort of well-formed. And so down at the bottom, there's an example there of how might we minimize the time needed by cancer survivors to navigate the financial implications of living with cancer. And so that would be a way you may frame to say, cool, that's the challenge. We're going to embark a team on that effort. We're going to deploy process, resources, what do we know, research, all of that. And at least that step is sort of a way to sort of structure a unified view of what is the challenge we're trying to tackle for the purpose of innovation. But beyond that, we say like that may be an outcome, but really this is sort of a cool little exercise you might try that really sort of brings this into a more rigorous process and often sort of results in sort of some aha moments where this is called a challenge mapping exercise, and sort of it's still arrived at sort of or anchored in the how might we statement. But what it's basically trying to reveal is there's a whole host of challenges you could choose to apply the process to. Even if you haven't picked one, this is a process that gives you the range. So if you start in the middle with the one we talked about before of how might we minimize the time needed for cancer survivors to navigate financial implications, that's one choice that we could choose as an organization to tackle as a challenge. To expand the range of choices, we ladder upward, and we simply ask the question of why would we want to do that? And based on the discussion in the team, you may say, well, you know, there's a lot of sort of distraction for these patients and worry and concern around that issue. And so maybe we say that, okay, well, maybe the challenge is maybe how might we lessen distracting worries for cancer survivors navigating life with cancer, right? And so we've elevated that level of the challenge. It's a whole different challenge. It came from the one in the middle, and we haven't yet decided which one we're going to do, but we're automatically now we've got more than one. And you can continue to do that higher. Well, why would we want to lessen the distracting worries from it? Well, maybe it results in tighter family relationships. And so, well, how might we build sort of stronger families within cancer survivors? And you sort of find yourself sort of exploring this range of options. The way you go down is you start with wherever you are and say, well, what's stopping us from doing that challenge? And the answer to that question sort of reveals sort of a lower order question. So the bottom there, how might we minimize the time needed for cancer survivors to compare the cost of treatment drug options? Where we would say, like, that's stopping us because they don't know how to compare prices, right? And so now you see we've taken that central first challenge statement, we've gone down to a sort of a lower level, more granular application of it. When you do this exercise, you can fill a wall with 50 different ways that we might tackle this core challenge that we thought we sort of knew, and then you invite the conversation of which one is it that we're actually going to sort of apply resources against, or more than one. And so this is a really helpful technique that you can do in 30 1-hour minute or 1-hour meeting, but it results in sort of that rigor to at least have the conversation. Do we know where we're putting these resources against, and sort of what is our goal?
Jeff, can I give one tip on that one?
Sure.
One, when we call this a challenge statement, the one, I think, mistake that we see some organizations make when they don't have a lot of practice at it is they frame the challenge statement as a challenge to the organization as opposed to the challenge to the individual you're trying to serve. So each of our challenge statements are phrased in a way to capture the challenge of the individuals we're serving as opposed to capturing it in a way that represents a challenge of the organization. So a challenge statement wouldn't include something like how do we break down the silos in our own organizations to serve people better. It's really about addressing a challenge that the person that you're serving is having that you've now captured through this great empathetic research you've been doing.
Right. The other sort of aspect of this will let you build sort of a chain of potential challenges up and down. And if you want to go left to right, you simply say sort of like, what else might be a reason why we want to do this? And sort of the responses you might get from the team, oh, this is another reason why we want to do that. You just sort of start building left to right, and you can sort of build this sort of terrain of challenge statements. It becomes particularly important because the way you frame the problem drives the outcome you're going to get. And if you skip that part, you've sort of missed the biggest chance you have to sort of orient the organization. So we often use the automotive example, responding to sort of the recent trends of sort of more urban density and sort of the return to sort of downtown living and the crowdedness, and certainly traffic we know in here in Austin. And so if you would respond to that with sort of a framing of how might we make it easier for car owners to maneuver and park in urban areas, you get sort of the response of automakers making smaller cars. And we saw that start to happen. If you frame sort of the same challenge in a different way that says how might we make it easier for people in urban areas to get around, then you sort of unlock the notion of the Ubers or the scooters we all hate around town and bicycles and buses. And so sort of the response to sort of the same sort of core opportunity framed in different ways results in sort of different outcomes. If you never go to that step at the beginning, you sort of don't know which one you've really sort of invested in sort of pursuing. And that's why we see it being so important.
All right, our last one today is addressing this issue of organizations, teams deciding that they want to do an ideation exercise to drive more innovation, a brainstorming exercise to drive more innovation, And they get people into a room that might even look like this because it's a cool space with a cool view, lots of whiteboards and places to hang stuff up. And they say, let's brainstorm, let's come up with new ideas. And it lacks intention and design in terms of allowing people to be more effective at idea creation. This is really then about the organization's process design, not being intentional about the process of ideation or brainstorming. So this often looks like this. I think this is actually a real picture, and the reason I chose it is it reminds me of several brainstorming sessions I was a part of where we did go to a cooler space in the building, and we sat around what looks like a comfortable, cool place, but was actually, everyone was wildly uncomfortable. The coffee table was too far away. I couldn't hold a laptop or a pen in my lap. So we want to be really intentional about this process. And part of this is what I have found to be one of the biggest revelations for just improving team dynamics overall, in addition to driving better ideation or brainstorming sessions. And that is the recognition that oftentimes we are all trained and approach our work using convergent thinking approaches. And convergent thinking, you might think of this as linear thinking. Some people call it rational or logical thinking. But ultimately, it's about narrowing down. It's about aiming towards the correct answer. And we see this in formal schooling. So most of the formal schooling we've had, my daughter's in 5th grade. Most of the education process that she learns is about narrowing down, making the right choice. And it's a contrast to the other type of thinking, which is divergent thinking, which we might call lateral or sideways thinking, creative thinking, out-of-the-box thinking, but overall about opening up, creating more options, creating more choices. I often give the example of in my own household when we're trying to choose a restaurant to go for the evening. My husband says, where do you want to go eat? And I'll say Chewy's, and he goes, okay, that sounds fine. And I'll say, well, wait, we could go to Maudie's, or we could go to Torchy's, or we could go to Polvo's. He's like, well, just pick one, any of those is fine. And I'm like, well, we just had Mexican 2 nights ago. You know, we could go to like Shady Grove, and he's like, just pick one. And I'm like, let's consider all the options. And the problem is that we have people in different contexts, but a lot of times across contexts, people who show up as more convergent thinkers or show up as more divergent thinkers. We put them into a room together and we just hope magic happens when one group wants to narrow it down and the other group wants to open up, and there's this tension between the two groups to do that. So what we want to do is create a sequence. Let me say one more thing here just to make my point here. I forgot I had these slides. Is convergent thinking gets us from a problem to a solution. What we want to do to drive more innovation is come up with more solution ideas to any one problem. And when we apply divergent thinking throughout the design process, what we actually do is we come up with a lot more problems to consider, as Jeff was describing with the challenge statements, and using it there as well, in addition to a number of solutions for any problem we might choose to do. And when you get teams together the first time to do this, it looks and feels like this. It feels very messy. It feels like there's a lot of activity that doesn't feel as structured. But it really, in reality, works like this in a very structured way. And what I typically do now in teams is actually draw on the board either a less than sign to demonstrate that we are diverging and we are opening up, and we all, even if we're convergent thinkers, need to honor this part of the process, because we are going to get to a part of the process where we're going to converge, and I switch the symbol on the board to demonstrate that we are converging now, and us as divergent thinkers need to honor that part of the process. It's time to choose now from this great selection we've got. So by coupling those together in a good sequence, we have an opportunity to open up and create new choices, and we have an opportunity to prioritize and make a choice to move on in the process. And that's what's really important about this. So here's a review, all in one chart. We wanted to put together the factors that we see really clearly, which is that center column. To the left here is what we see is the organizational context overall of what drives this factor on teams, in teams. And then the tools that we presented today that are really just one tool. We struggled a bit to try to narrow down to just 5 tools, honestly, because we love so many of them. But there are multiple tools that will help with any one of these factors. And we've tried to, this is what we'll actually send out later on as a one-pager that gives you all this on one place. And what we tried to do is give you a bit of an overview of a set of tools and factors that really, when you work within the design thinking process, becomes more intentional as you do this with teams. To a point that Jeff made at the very beginning, people have this assumption that design is the creative people getting together and making choices just because they're creative and they can do that. What really works, though, is a really rigorous process that has a set of steps to it and an outcome for each one of those that are really intentional to get us to the next stage and be more successful to ultimately drive more ideas that go beyond our traditional business models, and ideas that are actually appropriate to address individuals' human, real challenges. That's all we've got as content, and we wanted to open it up unless you have some.
Yeah, I was just going to reference, because someone mentioned it earlier, if you go back to the list, the reason we sort of put this up on the left side, and I think the reason we like introducing this content in this context of the business school is sort of those are really the core things that are sort of driving this innovation engine and sort of holding it up. And what we've seen time and again from organizations is sometimes they really want to focus on just the right side and like, I just got to train everybody on these little tactical exercises. But then if you're placing them in this sort of organizational structure that doesn't really support that and work that way, you know, they're not going to be successful, you know, or they're not going to be at the level that you want. And so someone mentioned earlier sort of the culture thing. And so what we've seen is all of these things eventually sort of hit the wall of what we need is a culture of innovation, right? And sort of how do we get the organization thinking that way? That's certainly very hard and harder than an hour conversation, but that's why we tried to say, like, even if you bring these tools and techniques, as leaders, remember where they're coming from, right? And sort of that's more helpful than saying, well, we just need to train everybody on how to do challenge mapping. You're like, no, maybe we need to sort of improve the way our process is built, that everybody sort of understands where they fit. And so that's a bigger opportunity. It's harder, but I think that's what unlocks it versus sort of just training people on tactics. So that was just a comment I wanted to make as you think about how you sort of unlock some things and where you can make the best application. So yeah, any questions or any, we've certainly seen a lot of the points you made earlier.
Are you familiar with the change methodology, appreciative inquiry?
Yeah.
Right? And just, I see so much overlap, you know, help reference design, design thinking, right? And
Right.
just process-wise, and just sort of orientation group, because these large-scale change initiatives, but that the importance of questions.
Right.
It's probably the fundamental component of that, right? And the questions that we ask at the beginning, and helping people connect with, you know, their best experiences, right? And how to create more of those. Anyway, just
Right. No, it's
Yeah.
useful. I mean,
questions.
she was asking if we were familiar with appreciative design or
Appreciative inquiry.
Inquiry.
But it came out of like the change management.
Yeah.
Right.
Approach, right? And
Something's called a more beautiful question. There's articles written about more beautiful question.
So there's two elements to that, right? It's sort of introducing the questioning in that aspect. We talk about challenge management, but a bit also like the divergent conversion, right? It doesn't take the approach of like, oh, you're stupid, this is wrong, it'll never work, which too often happens when we have those sort of colliding forces of why we can't do something versus sort of what we could do.
But it also brings in, so you know, I always feel like it's a little bit more advanced topic, but the idea that a lot of times what we're doing, especially because we call them challenge statements and we focus on where people are facing barriers in their lives, it also brings in the notion of we want to understand where people are experiencing delight in their lives, where they're having wonderful experiences, because if we can replicate those across other contexts in our lives, those represent opportunities for innovation in contrast to what we're doing today in those experiences. Is that what you've seen, Julie, in that conversation? Yeah. That's good.
I think, go ahead.
Yeah.
I work with a bunch of different people on my team, and what's great about the team is like divergent thinkers and convergent thinkers, and that diamond, I think it's just such a great way to kind of remind myself to appreciate that process.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, me too.
And you know, kind of like get all these ideas, but also hone in and focus on the solution.
Right.
Yeah, it's funny, in my own teams, I'll just get in the, you know, sort of the mix of the day-to-day, and we're in a meeting and something's going on. I'm like, we need more ideas on this, and then I'll realize what we're doing, and I'm like, oh, time out. Let's be really clear. Let's stop. Sorry, my bad, back up. Do we need to diverge and create more options, more ideas, or do we need to converge and actually select something, and let's really honor that process, because it really does affect teams in a super positive way. And it's a challenge because we do also advocate in the design process to bring more diverse perspectives to the table, because the way that you understand people's lives are so much shaped by your own experiences, your background, right? So what you see and what you don't see is often a component of your background, your experiences. And the more diversity of thought, the more diversity of experiences you have on the team, the more likely you are to, if not recognize, at least consider that there are other reasons or other causes or other perspectives in terms of what you're seeing. But that makes the team dynamics harder, and so you have to be even more intentional when you have diverse people on the team to honor that process.
Right.
It's a great thought.
Helpful language.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yep, yep.
Yeah, yeah.
You can, we use the example of a brainstorm, but what you can do as a simple sort of trick of that is like that really maps out the process that you might want to apply in your team. You're going through those cycles in different steps. So even when you get to sort of the notion of rapid prototyping, you want to test something, that's what you're doing. You're trying some bunch of different things, and then you're sort of putting them out in the world to see what people think so that you can narrow back down and make the next iteration better. So it's not just a brainstorm thing. It really sort of maps across the whole process. But really just knowing where are you when you're doing something is the most helpful.
Probably one of the biggest takeaways I've gotten from this is that like in our organization, we have an organizational bias to convergent thinking.
Yeah.
Solution right now
Right.
to end the problem.
Yeah.
And inside of this conversation, I was looking at one of the ways that we had done that because people feel like coming to see their CPAs like going to see the dentist.
Yeah.
Or that you find out they're not sleeping at night because they're afraid of this IRS problem they've been afraid to talk to somebody about.
Yeah.
And I realized that what I put on top of that is more like a Band-Aid that's following the process.
Right.
I stole the employee initiative from Amy's Ice Cream, which was to have when people come in, to have this be the best part of their day, to ask people for a while.
Yeah,
You know,
yeah.
That's
they
great,
actually
great.
get that experience.
Yeah.
Right. That's awesome.
But we didn't go through the whole process to actually have it be a cultural thing.
Right. And so the net result is you're missing sort of opportunity is what you can say. It's not just I want to have fun and use sticky notes. It's like this is business opportunity that we're not tackling that we could be because we're not deploying a process like this.
Well, and again, to make sure it's additive and not replacing, there is a time and a place for convergent thinking, right? Someone's bleeding out, you want the EMT to converge and make some choices really quickly, right? This just happened to a friend of mine who wrecked his bike, and it's like you want someone to respond really quickly and know what they're doing and make a choice now as opposed to just considering all the ways that this could be treated, right? It's just that it holds up and prevents innovation, which is a different kind of challenge, right? So that's what's I think is really important about the clarity of that.
Well, I just really like that convergent as a framework for
Yeah.
thinking, as a framework for having a conversation. It makes it easier to stay on topic, to stay organized, and not to float out.
When I do it in a class, I'm probably overselling it now, but when I do it in a class, I tell people, like, I'm about to change your team working life forever. Forever. It's life-changing in terms of team dynamics.
No, I mean, that's fantastic.
Yeah,
We've all experienced it, right? You've all been in that meeting,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
So
yeah.
it's one way to help.
So the process is a question, not a statement. I think
Yeah.
here we are living in Austin, tech capital, all about the data. We've got analytics companies, right? And so I'm curious if you have strategies for opening people's minds to the opportunity. So I'm kind of an ethnographer, right? And so I'm
Great.
Yeah.
preaching to the choir here. But I think the problem that you run into is helping people understand
The value.
right?
I'm going to repeat the question for Jeff to tackle for the viewing audience. So we, especially in Austin, we live in this very technology-centric, data-centric environment. How you consult with organizations to get them to appreciate the more qualitative data sets that are helpful to drive innovation.
I mean, what we see a lot of times is what Stephen mentioned earlier, right? That when that's the reliance on the data or tech view of it, it's sort of the absence of the other one, and right? And so it's sort of not saying it's wrong, it's sort of missing the other piece. So oftentimes just having the conversation with the organization of like, tell me about this person we're trying to serve as a human being. Just let's have the actually describe it to me. Let's map it out. It's sort of like a quick, almost like the persona thing, or that's where the empathy map tool works, because it forces you to say, what does this person think about today, or what do they do, what do they see? And what you'll usually find is like nobody's really thought of that, and you might get the aha of like, oh, maybe that would be helpful, right? And so as long as you don't go into it as like, well, your view is wrong, and this is what we need to do, that never works. But sort of bringing that appreciation for that, and as I mentioned, even in that clinic experience, like maybe it's helpful for us as our business. Imagine like where we fit in people's lives in new places that we haven't considered in the past. That's sort of the challenge we're sort of facing now, where every brand thinks that they need to be in everybody's life at every moment, right? That's the goal. Like none of us want that. So that's sort of how you sort of bring that other thing of like, there's places for us to be as a brand, but we need to know where they are and where people invite us in, and that's sort of a way of why we need to know that human point of view. The data won't tell us that, right? And so that's sort of the revelation that we try. But yeah, I mean, it's sometimes you're sort of evangelizing it, but yeah, you'll see.
Also, the nice thing is it's getting easier. I'm finding more and more people being appreciative and understanding that they lack qualitative data and that's a missing component. They want to know how to get it and how to get it effectively. Yeah, over the last 10 years, there's been this, I think, a greater appreciation because they've recognized that they've got these big data sets now. I think it was before when there was a lack of the big data, they felt like if I could just get more and more quantitative data, the answer will exist there. But they've realized now they've got huge amounts of quantitative data, and it's still not helping them answer a lot of really basic questions about understanding their people at a more human level.
Right.
The other thing I didn't mention earlier was the empathy map. What it does with teams is, especially if you start with a segment that they know about, like they feel like they know this segment and they serve it well, as the team builds the empathy map, it's almost always the case where the team starts to realize there's actually at least two different kinds of people in this segment in terms of how they experience life in the context that we're focused on. And that realization is so revelatory to a lot of people and causes them to rethink all the things they've been doing and who have they been serving and have they been serving them well, because they've thought as the segment is monolithic as opposed to being made up of a number of individuals. And the challenge really then is to figure out what matters most in this context in terms of how we serve them, right? So that's the good discussion that happens from that point.
I'm just curious about the conversion process of it. Do you find that it's better to like have a smaller group or a larger group? Because I'm concerned about too many hallucinations.
Mm-hmm.
Or like, I guess, how do you even set up your groups?
Oh, good question. So the question is how, we got smaller groups, larger groups, how do we effectively set up the teams with the right size to even introduce a divergent, convergent process that's effective? Is that good?
Yeah, I think there's no right answer, but I think it's something we often see, like, how do you want to facilitate the group, right? And so a typical thing we say, 8 people is a good number of people if you're individually facilitating a discussion or a group, right, at an initiative level. But really got to think bigger on the process, right? Of, it doesn't have to be every person involved in every single step, and it doesn't have to be just like one session, one initiative. So what you can do is sort of map out like a series of sort of group interactions of a certain size that's manageable for your organization. So you could have 3 initiatives that have groups of 10 or something that, it's hard to do this in sort of 100 people in a room at the same time sort of exercise, but I'd say there's no right answer, but sort of, this is back to sort of what does your organizational culture sort of best support, would be sort of the right way to think about it.
Yeah, and I would just add somewhere, I think Jeff's honing around it, but doesn't want to say as probably as specifically, because I would go somewhere in the 6 to 10 range.
Yeah, I mean,
Where past 10 you start to get too big, but when you're presented with a group, like if we get asked to facilitate something like this, it's where I immediately start to break them off into teams and clusters so that they're each running the process amongst their teams and we're doing a share out. We were doing a group of 12 or 14 people last Friday, and I broke them into 3 different groups and had them working on the exact same problem, but the tables were coming up. We were actually challenge statement mapping. And, well, first developing challenge statements and then laddering them up and down. And what I did was I had each table working on a challenge statement based on a known sort of set of issues. And then as they did that, I had them then shift. So this set of challenge statements went to this table, these challenge statements went to this table, and they all rotated their challenge statements, which was disruptive to them because they started to really lean in and like certain challenge statements. And ultimately, as a group, they were going to have to come to some consensus, not just from these small teams. And it was helping them see the perspective of thought around it. And then they had to work on that set, and then we rotated again. And so there's a lot of different ways it can be facilitated. I was going to throw in, I have found now, I'm more and more an advocate of facilitation of these sessions because of that reason. Someone who has experience, who can read the dynamics in a room and adjust accordingly as you move through the process. They can read individuals. They can read sort of the general tone and tension or lack of tension. They can read the sort of leaning in versus leaning out kind of behaviors and adjust real time for it. It's really
a key tip on that, if you are a person sort of running an initiative on a meeting, like, and you are the facilitator, like the number one thing is if you're a facilitator, you're not a participant. And too often people mix those right. I'm going to help lead it, and then like, oh, I've got an idea. How about this? And you start like blurring those lines, it's almost impossible, right? So if you're a facilitator, you're sort of outside the process, sort of guiding that through, and sort of that helps you keep it on track. But oftentimes you facilitate as like one of the team, and it sort of can be very difficult.
I also, by the way, the more innovative or the more new or the riskier thing that we're trying to do, the more likely I am to extract the leader. If the leader's not allowed to be involved, because it just completely changes the dynamic of the conversation. Everyone wants to please or be deferential to the leader, and it's too problematic for really driving forward with something interesting.
Yep.
So, yeah. We probably have one more question, I think, right? And then we'll stick around.
We can stick around, yeah. But
Yeah, we'll stick around, but one more question for the cameras, I think.
Okay, so when you're driving to that top level
Yep.
transformational change, one of the things that I've kind of observed that is when you go into a company and it's being done within the product department, is that the department could be 20 people. It's kind of like all the same person.
yeah.
So when you start putting, so when they start breaking out into teams, I just get the feeling that there isn't enough kind of divergent thinking.
Yeah.
However, they also feel like they own it.
Mhm.
So mixing it up with other people within the organization gets a little difficult.
Mhm.
So can you kind of speak to that or give some suggestions on how to kind of get them to think bigger?
I mean, the first we've seen is there's a lot of value for who owns this initiative being somebody that's above the silos, right? Oftentimes somebody will be leading this big transformation innovation initiative, but they'll be sort of buried in one of the silos, and then they bring all that bias with them, right, in their team. So if you can find somebody at a level that sort of has responsibility across the silos, then it's much easier to get it started. As we mentioned in one of the tips, like you've got to find a way to sort of invite sort of the cross departmental or skill set sort of thing. This is a thing where you can make a choice. Say, these people are better at the divergent part. I'm going to invite them. Then I might do a second session that's more convergent. That would be a choice you could do to get more people involved. But I think the first is if people can see the ownership outside of their domain, right, then that sort of starts to unlock stuff. And all these tools can be used for that. We really didn't talk about the intersections of these, but the empathy map or the persona, for example, is super good at like aligning different teams, right? Because if nobody's done that, they all formulate their own view of who they think the customer is, right? And it's just them.
Yeah.
So
First
that's a great
mistake.
tool to say, cool, now
Product
remember, we're
design.
trying to do this big initiative, and this is the person we're trying to understand, and sort of diffuses sometimes the sort of the biases that they have brought. And sometimes, so if you're in that role as a leader, like a lot of these things can sort of get rid of that turf war that happens, right? Is it happens because nobody's inserted this higher level view, so everybody makes their own, and then they battle over it, and then we don't get anywhere, right? So that's what I would say is sort of one way to sort of think about it. And then certainly the framing, challenge mapping is helpful to say this is bigger than your department's sort of challenge. And then I'd say somebody brought it up at the beginning, but what's different now is sort of like this competition thing, right? There's a lot of urgency out there, which is why a lot of these CEOs are saying they're going to be doing a lot of stuff, because there's a sense of this, like, we better get this figured out. So you can tap into that of like getting resources, getting attention, because everybody wants it a lot quicker, and there's awareness now that there didn't used to be even 10 years ago, that the competition isn't coming from like your sector all the time anymore, right? There's this cross thing. It used to be if you worked at Dell, you worried about what HP does, right? And now you're in this world of like, what's Amazon doing? I saw that this week, just a FedEx listed Amazon as like one of their biggest competitors now, right? Mm-hmm. And you're like, so that's driving this organization to think, we got to think bigger, sort of like, you'll hear that phrase sometimes, let's conceptualize how to put ourselves out of business before someone else does, right? That topic is sometimes, oh, you're right, and gets this sort of, but you have to find a way to sort of, at people to sort of release those sort of really internal biases of their department. Right.
I'll give you three things very quickly to add on. One is it's harder to do within a team, but if you've got an organizational champion, it's more helpful, is when you've got people identified as the voice of the customer who have to be in the room for these conversations, and their role is to advocate for the customer, to say, no, that's not helpful to me as a customer because here's the issue I'm facing, right? So they're assigned that role, and everyone's clear, like they are here to challenge our traditional notions of how we design our products by bringing the voice of the customer in. You can sometimes, the second one is you can sometimes do that internally. It depends on what kind of product team you have or what different roles are, but you can assign people different roles on the team to essentially be that kind of advocate, pusher, challenger, devil's advocate, right? And importantly, you rotate the roles throughout the sessions, that people have to play different kinds of roles, and they don't, it just puts them off a little bit off their game or off their sort of normal tunnel vision, and if done well, can be actually even fun for a group. Yeah, yeah. The third way is there are some tools that we use, especially during the ideation process. I was just doing this with a student group who they're all getting their MS in information technology management, and they are one of the more similar profiles that I experience across our programs. And we were working on a healthcare challenge, actually, because Jeff's saying healthcare keeps popping up everywhere, and it's a fun challenge to be on, especially in the technology space. And there's a technique we do called alternate worlds, where we ask them, now that we've framed the challenge statement really well and really clearly, what if we handed this challenge statement to Disney? How would they address this challenge? And what if we handed it to Uber or to Amazon or any kind of company or brand that we feel like we know about the experience, and they would all come at this challenge really differently? Opens them up to, oh my gosh, there are lots of sort of even crazy ways that you could solve this challenge, and it gets them out of their traditional product-focused sort of historical approaches as well. Really fast, too, and they seem to really enjoy it. It's always fun. It's a great ending question. So I want to say again how honored we are that you would spend your Friday lunch with us. It's a big deal. So thank you. I hope you have a great afternoon and weekend. You got anything else?
Wonderful, yeah, to know there's more in town, people sort of thinking this way. So we're happy to help with any other questions afterwards, but this is exciting.
Yeah, thank you all so much.